So we're talking about not getting the most ethical people, and it's just totally elitist that they assume you're wealthy, you're good for the country. He's a walking, talking financial conflict of interest. Mark Carney is right now.
Over the past week, Mark Carney's left and right hands were called to testify at the Standing Committee for Privacy and Ethics for the purpose of answering questions relating to Mark Carney's ethics screens as a result of his over 100 conflicts of interest. Today, we're talking with Duff Conacher, founder of Democracy Watch, who has been advocating for massive changes to the Conflict of Interest Act and who has reviewed the testimony of both Michael Sabia and marc-andré Blanchard, who argues, don't worry, nothing to see here. Did they change his mind? Let's take a look. Duff, welcome back to more Northern Perspective. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so you've reviewed the testimony by Michael Sabia. You reviewed the testimony by marc-andré Blanchard. We've covered both of them. What's your take, or maybe let's go this way. For those that have not seen the testimonies of both, what would you say your summary is of both of their testimonies in your mind?
Well, Michael Sabia, the clerk of the Privy Council office, which really should just be changed to the Cabinet office, just for plain language, so everyone would understand what it does. He's the top official. He was chosen by Prime Minister Mark Carney, serves at his pleasure. And he's one of the two top people, along with marc-andré Blanchard, the chief of staff to the Prime Minister, also chosen by and serving at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. They're the top two people who essentially ensure this compliance system with this ethics screen that Mark Carney has. And so what Mr. Sabia did was defend the screen largely, and then did give some statistics, which Democracy Watch has been trying to dig out of the Privy Council office through the Access to Information Act. And they said they won't give us a response until January, or until next March, actually, about this screen. And he, though, gave a few numbers. And what he said was that 13 files have been reviewed under the screen. And he didn't really define what a file is, but it seems like, from the testimony of marc-andré Blanchard, that a file is something where a department is going to propose something to Cabinet, a spending program, a bill. They write a Cabinet memo. They send up a whole big file of documents to the Cabinet. Cabinet committee reviews it, and then the whole Cabinet. That's what he seems to mean by a file. So 13 have been flagged as potentially raising conflicts of interest with these Brookfield and other companies, the more than 100 companies that he has financial conflicts of interest with that are part of the screen. And then 5 of them were deemed to not actually affect businesses that are part of the screen. 2 of them were allowed to go through because they deal with general changes to law, and I'll talk about that a bit more. And then 6 of them were flagged as actually causing conflicts of interest for the Prime Minister. And 2 of those have been completed. And so we mentioned what they were about tax changes. Another 4 are ongoing. And so he said, I can't talk about those because then we'd be alerting the Prime Minister that there are these processes going on and he may try to intervene, and he's supposed to be prevented from intervening. So that was Michael Sabia's testimony, essentially. And the big issues it raises are, 13 files, big major files coming out of government departments. And he said Mark Carney was allowed to participate in 2 of them, even though he has a financial conflict of interest. Why? Because there's a gigantic loophole, the biggest loophole in the Conflict of Interest Act, that says if you're dealing with something that applies generally or affects a broad group of people or businesses, you're allowed, even if you have a financial interest in the outcome of the decision and could profit from that decision, you're allowed to participate. So in 2 files, Mark Carney was still allowed to participate, even though he has a financial conflict of interest. So Conflict of Interest Act does not prevent prime ministers from profiting from their own decisions because of this gigantic loophole. The second part was, that's key, is 6 of the 13 files were identified and the prime minister is not allowed to participate in them. So in 6 of 13, almost half of big files moving through the government, Mark Carney is not allowed to do his job. He's not allowed to exercise his powers as prime minister. Both of those are serious problems. One, that the prime minister cannot do his job half of the time when it comes to policy making because of his financial investments that cause conflicts of interest. And secondly, he is allowed to participate in some files and make decisions that he could profit from because of the huge loophole in the act. So that was Michael Sabia's testimony. And why don't I take a break? And if you have any questions about that before I talk about Marc-André Blanchard's testimony.
Sure. And there's a couple things that stood out to me in the Sabia exchanges. Number one was the amount of effort it seems that has to go into actually screening the prime minister. So we're using now taxpayer money and taxpayer time to actually have other people bend the process, review the process, and walk on eggshells around Mark Carney because of his own personal financial interest. Has nothing to do with the government. And second, Michael Barrett asked Mr. Sabia for essentially an ongoing update or list, to your point, the statistics of how many conflicts of interest, are flagged or potential conflicts of interest are flagged. And they want to know, on an ongoing basis, most likely so they can actually expose what I think is common sense, that if you have a prime minister that is this conflicted and this many conflicts of interest, to your point, they can't do their job, and they're elected to be the prime minister. They're elected to make decisions, and they're elected to lead this country. So what does it say if you have all these conflicts of interest and so many that you're prevented from doing your job? Doesn't that fly in the face of the whole point of the office?
Yeah, there's another big issue with that, though, which is Michael Sabia also said when he was asked, well, what about these announcements that Mark Carney has made about, we're going to do this modular housing. We're going to have an initiative in that. We're going to have a pipeline. We're going to have different things on carbon and climate and other policy issues. And so he has investments in Brookfield, and Brookfield is active in all of these areas. So why is he making announcements? He's not supposed to, just to remind everyone what the law says, you're not allowed to participate in any discussion, decision, or vote. So that means all your communications, everything you say, every conversation, every email, text, every phone call, every online call you do, all of those are covered, and you're not allowed to participate when you have a conflict of interest. Again, there's this huge loophole that actually does allow you to participate in anything that applies generally, and lots of decisions apply generally. But the general rule is all these things are covered. So how is it Mark Carney's making announcements about initiatives from the government that the government is going to do that would affect Brookfield investments? And Michael Sabia said, oh, well, those are just announcements. Those are not decisions. Well, sorry, but the act covers more than decisions, covers discussions and all communications. So he shouldn't be talking about any file in which there's a conflict of interest with Brookfield. Again, it may affect Brookfield specifically, and then it would be illegal. As long as it affects Brookfield generally, along with other businesses, it's legal for him to participate. But that's just the general concept. And Sabia was trying to say, no, he's allowed to make announcements, and he's kind of saying, no, take part in all sorts of discussions, even when he has a financial conflict of interest. And the act prohibits that. The second part, though, is when he makes this announcement, okay, then let's say a policymaking process starts on modular housing or some other thing that Brookfield has a financial interest in, is active in. And he's already made the announcement about what the government wants to do. Well, even if Mark Carney doesn't participate, all the other cabinet ministers who he has chosen, and all of whom serve at his pleasure, know what he wants because he made the announcement. And so it doesn't really work with the prime minister. He steps aside, but everyone serving at his pleasure knows what he wants and then goes and does what he wants because they're all just arms of him, right? They're not independent. They serve at his pleasure. He controls them. He's the ultimate decision maker. And so the system doesn't even work. You can say he's not allowed to participate, according to Michael Sabia, in half of the big files that have come up to cabinet since July. But it doesn't matter if he's participating, if he's already said what he wants. Cabinet will just implement it anyway. So it's just a layer cake of conflicts of interest where Carney's in dozens of conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest. And then you have people serving at his pleasure who are supposedly enforcing this screen, and cabinet ministers serving at his pleasure who's implementing what he wants. They're all in a conflict of interest. They all share the conflict of interest that the prime minister shares and has multiple conflicts of interest. And it's not an ethical system at all. And it's all legal, amazingly, under an act called the Conflict of Interest Act. Conflicts of interest are not prevented, prohibited, or penalized. It's truly
and that's a good segue actually into Marc-André Blanchard, because one of the things that Sabia was asked is, have you told Mark Carney not to talk to Brookfield? And Sabia kind of tried to dance around that and said, I don't have to tell him. Well, but have you? Well, I don't need to. He already knows. Okay, well, how does he already know? Well, he's spoken to the ethics commissioner. Well, that's great. If he didn't talk with Brookfield and the ethics commissioner told him not to talk to Brookfield, then moving over to Marc-André Blanchard's testimony, why did he talk to Brookfield? Because here's the big problem. So Sabia can say, well, we can't talk about some of these cases because they're ongoing, and that would let him know what's actually in here. You think the investors and the and the other business heads of some of these companies that may be involved in some of these discussions, you think they care? They can talk to him and say, hey, by the way, we've had your ministers talking to us and they're discussing this right now. Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. So how do you know that that's not even happening? And it's a huge concern for Mark Carney to be having literally any conversations that are not recorded and that are not under any oversight whatsoever when he has direct financial stakes in them or even indirect financial stakes in them. Would you agree?
Yes. He's a walking, talking financial conflict of interest, Mark Carney is right now. Pretty much whenever he makes a decision involved in any discussion or conversation, phone call, email chain, text with people, where he's talking about anything that affects business in Canada. Now, the Conflict of Interest Act says as long as what he's talking about was something that applies to a bunch of businesses, applies generally, he's allowed to take part in all those discussions that lead to policy decisions that affect those businesses, because the Conflict of Interest Act has this gigantic loophole. 99% of decisions that the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers participate in apply generally, because they change general laws and general taxes, tax credits, all those things, subsidies, spending. It all applies generally to lots of different businesses or individuals. And then, therefore, it's legal. So the Conflict of Interest Act allows for financial conflicts of interest and allows cabinet ministers to profit from their own decisions and secretly profit. Just to back up a bit, so what's supposed to happen is this ethics screen would come in and at least screen them out of some decisions. There were actually more than one ethics screen. When Carney started as prime minister, he hadn't engaged with the ethics commissioner. He set up his own ethics screen. And he then went and met with Brookfield and others soon after becoming prime minister. And what Michael Sabia said about that was, well, that was the other ethics screen. The problem for the prime minister is As soon as he becomes prime minister, the Conflict of Interest Act says you can't take part in discussions, conversations, phone calls, decisions, or votes where you have a conflict of interest. And so it doesn't matter that it was his own screen that he set up and it was ineffective. The law still applies. And so I think Carney has violated the Conflict of Interest Act. Incredibly, members of the public, I can't file a complaint with the ethics commissioner and have the ethics commissioner be required to rule on it publicly. Only MPs can file complaints and senators can file complaints about cabinet ministers and top government officials. MPs from all parties decided to shut out the public from filing complaints about cabinet ministers and MPs and senators, even though we pay for all these people and we pay the ethics commissioner as our watchdog over all these people. We're not allowed to file a complaint and have it ruled on. But hopefully an MP will file a complaint, because I think Carney has violated the Conflict of Interest Act already, because he has taken part in discussions, decisions, votes that affect businesses he's invested in. We'll see what happens with that. Just talking a bit more about what Blanchard said was, so Michael Sabia said there'd been screening of 13 files, which seemed to be big proposals from government departments up to cabinet. Marc-André Blanchard added some more clarification in response to more specific questions from MPs in his testimony as chief of staff to the prime minister. And he said that if someone's trying to call the prime minister into the prime minister's office or arrange a meeting with him, that the staff know that certain companies, lobbyists, are not allowed to talk to him. But what is still unclear is, and seemed to be from the testimony, Mark Carney can initiate calls himself, and no one is screening those. And what Marc-André Blanchard said more than once during his testimony, Mark Carney knows what he's supposed to do and what he's not supposed to do, and he is regulating himself in those cases. So that's not an effective system that's preventing.
What? Why not, Duff?
Everyone would like to regulate themselves, but self-regulation has been proven in several studies to be completely ineffective. People break the rules when they're the only ones who are watching themselves. And so the ethics screen and compliance system is not effective. It's effective with files. Those are big and easy. You know, a department wants cabinet to make a decision on something. They're going to send up their cabinet memo. Well, you just can say Carney can't see all that info or go to any of the meetings that reviews it. But communications, which are also covered by the Act, are much more difficult to screen out. And, he's traveling and talking with people all the time when he's traveling. No one's watching that. He's making calls himself, emailing people, texting people. Marc-André Blanchard said Mark Carney watches himself. So that's not a screen. That's just himself deciding whether to push something forward that would benefit his investments, which will benefit himself. That's not a system that's preventing conflicts of interest at all. It's just I call it a smokescreen. And even worse than that, and another big reason it's a smokescreen is he made one statement saying, I will not take part in decisions other than decisions that apply generally or that affect a broad group of people or businesses if I am invested in one of the companies affected by the decision. So he's only screened out from very, very specific decisions that only affect a few companies. Otherwise, he's allowed to participate. So he made that one statement. In the law, it says every time he steps aside from a discussion, decision, or vote that affects a conflict of interest he has, he's supposed to declare it publicly within 60 days. But the ethics commissioner has set up these screens. He makes the one statement, and then he never discloses again whether he's actually participating in decisions or not participating in them because of his conflicts of interest. And that's a smokescreen. It's hiding the fact that he's actually participating in most decisions where, even though he can profit from the decision, It's hiding the fact that he's stepping aside sometimes. Only Michael Sabia disclosed that. He just volunteered it. It was no requirement to disclose any details. And so it's a true smokescreen, and it's a complete sham, and it hides the fact that the Conflict of Interest Act really doesn't prevent, prohibit, or penalize conflicts of interest.
Well, and let's talk about communications in this, because there was the first instance, I think, of a conflict of interest that we saw was immediately after he made his disclosure. And we saw that he had interest in Westinghouse. And this immediately drew us like a lightning rod back to the French leaders debate during the election, because in the French leaders debate during the election, I believe this was on April 16th. They were asked, they said, do you think that nuclear has a role to play in, in Canada's economy going forward? And virtually everybody said yes. And Marc Carney specifically cited, we have great nuclear companies up here like Candu and Cameco and Westinghouse. So to me, that is a blatant violation of the Conflict of Interest Act, because he was prime minister at the time.
Yes.
And he is in a leaders debate talking about national policy. His conflicts of interest aren't even disclosed, and he is out there advertising to the world that here's the strategy and the direction that we're going to be taking if I get elected as a Liberal government. And he's pointing out companies that he has a financial stake in. I don't know how you get any more blatant than that when you're talking about conflicts of interest.
Yes. And so what Marc-andré Blanchard said, and Michael Sabia, I believe, was also questioned about this. They said there's 5 companies in this sector of making small modular reactors, and the budget has a measure about that in terms of tax changes that affect that sector. And they said, oh, well, because it's 5 companies, it's affecting a broad class, a broad group of companies. But 5 is not a broad group of companies. It's a very small group of companies. So if that's their standard for him being able to participate in decisions, and it seems pretty clear that he participated in development of the budget, even though it has a whole bunch of different things in there that affect businesses he's invested in through Brookfield or directly. If they're saying, well, he can do that because it applies to 5 companies. I mean, pretty much every decision he's making with regard to business sector applies to 5 or more companies in each sector. And so he's allowed to participate in all decisions is essentially what they're saying. And what remains unclear after this testimony is, so Michael Sabia said 13 files were screened and he couldn't participate in 6. But what he didn't say is how many communications, how many meetings have been prevented, how many phone calls, how many have been screened, how many have been reviewed to say you can't go to that meeting, you can't go to that phone call. And we're trying to dig that out through an access to information request. And what I think it's going to show when we finally get it out, they're trying to hide the information. As I said, it was supposed to have been disclosed already, but they're not going to disclose it till March. What I think it's going to show is 99% of the time, when he has a financial conflict of interest, they have allowed him to go ahead and participate because the decision, the discussion, the conversation, the meeting, whatever, was talking about something that applies generally. And that's true, that 99% of the decisions they make apply generally. There isn't a Royal Bank Act. There's a Bank Act. There isn't a Brookfield law. There's a law for each of the sectors that Brookfield is invested in, and there's a whole bunch of companies in those sectors, so they all apply generally. So essentially what they admitted was Marc Carney is allowed to participate in decisions, even when he has a financial interest in the outcome and could profit from the decision that he makes himself. That's not a conflict of interest system. I mean, it's just a sham facade. Call it the Conflict of Interest Act, but 99% of the time it doesn't apply when you have a conflict of interest. It shouldn't be called the Conflict of Interest Act. I've always argued it should be called, because of this loophole, should be called the Almost Impossible to be in a Conflict of Interest Act. That would be an accurate title for this law.
Yeah, and they don't really even define what general even means. That's the problem in the Conflict of Interest Act. So
That has
really
been defined a little bit, but not to the detail that needs to be defined. And the ethics commissioner, when he testified before the committee in September, kind of hemmed and hawed and said, "Oh, I can't. There's no general definition I can come up with." Well, yes, there is. You say, what applies generally? How many businesses does it have to affect? Right. How many people does it have to affect? And you draw a line, and everything below that would be narrow enough and specific enough that you would be prohibited. But he's hemming and hawing for clearly from his testimony, from everything he said since he became ethics commissioner, handpicked by the Trudeau cabinet. Clearly, he is in favor of having a weak system that facilitates wealthy big business people moving into public office. He wants that, and he's doing everything he can to make it easy for Carney to keep all his investments instead of what he should be doing, which is selling them.
Now, one of the things that both Sabia and Blanchard were asked is about this this fund where Marc Carney has a bunch of investments in, but what is in that fund hasn't been disclosed. So Canadians can see there's all these companies where he has direct investments in and direct shares in. So that's one thing. But there's this fund where Canadians don't know what's in there, and it's just listed as one line in his conflicts of interest. And both of them were asked, do you know what's in this fund? And both of them said no. And Sabia was asked, well, how could you possibly maintain an ethics screen for Marc Carney as to what's in that? And he said, well, the ethics commissioner knows. Okay, so, well, how do you even know when to talk to the ethics commissioner? And he's trying to say, well, we know what sectors that this fund is allegedly involving. So whenever, one of those sectors come across our desk, we're going to talk to the ethics commissioner. And he was trying to say, we do that all the time. And then Blanchard kind of contradicted what Sabia said. And we said, yeah, well, we don't really check with the ethics commissioner that often. So what was telling from in that aspect from the two witnesses and their testimony competing with each other?
Yeah, first those contradictions. And the ethics commissioner, when he testified, his name's Conrad von Finkenstein, when he testified in September, he said, I'm not involved in administering it. It's administered, the screen is administered by the chief of staff and the Privy Council clerk. I can't be involved in administering it because if there was a complaint that Carney had violated the screen and violated the act in some way, I have to be the judge of that. So I couldn't be administering it and then judge myself whether it had been administered correctly. And so I think the committee should call the ethics commissioner back and say, look, you said you're not involved in this, but they say you're involved in it weekly, if not daily sometimes, if there's an issue in terms of clarifying what is allowed or isn't allowed. Secondly, this fact that Carney's invested in funds, he also has stock options, according to media reports, worth millions in Brookfield that he knows he owns until 2033, 2034. So it's not like he put some investments, some stock that he owns in the trust, and the trustee may have sold some of those stocks since, and he wouldn't know that. But with the Brookfield stock options, they can't be sold. These are a device that corporations give to executives and board members to keep them looking at the long-term interests of the company. And so you can't sell them until years later, in this case, 2033, 2034. So Carney doesn't have a blind trust in his biggest investments. He's invested in this Brookfield fund. He has stock options with Brookfield, and he knows that he owns those. He's not blind to it at all. In addition, he chose the trustee, and he was able to he's allowed under the law to give initial instructions to the trustee. So he could have said, don't sell anything. And as a result, he knows that he owns everything that is in there, more than 550 companies that he's invested in. But let's just stick to the ones we know for sure he owns. Brookfield Fund, stock options in Brookfield. He knows he has that financial conflict of interest. We know this, as we've talked about, the screen's ineffective, and the law has this huge loophole. And so he's just a walking, talking financial conflict of interest every time, pretty much, he makes a decision that affects any business sector in Canada, because Brookfield is active in and has investments or companies and its conglomerate that are active in pretty much every big business sector in Canada. And so it's just a completely ineffective system. It's a sad joke.
Well, and now it seems that there's, whether it's targeted media, whether it's paid influencers, or whether this is just the general public starting to say this, I'm starting to see some messaging on social media now that people are saying, well, so what if he's profiting from these companies? That's good for Canada. Like, what do you take away from that?
Yeah, you can't have a system that allows a public office holder to be personally profiting from decisions they make. They're supposed to be making decisions in the public interest. And if they have any sense in their head, and the reason that the system's supposed to prevent them from participating in decisions when they have a conflict of interest, is that you can't do a Vulcan mind meld, right? Nobody can look in someone's mind like Spock could on Star Trek and tell what they're thinking. And so they can always say, I'm only making decisions in the public interest. I'm only doing what's good for the Canadian economy. I would never do anything for myself. They can say that, but in their own head, they may be saying, no, I'm going to change this little tax credit. It's going to make me more money so that I come out at the end with profit from my investments. And the international standard is prevention. Has to be prevented. If you actually participate in a decision that you can profit from, that's corruption. So we have to prevent conflicts of interest in order to prevent self-dealing, personal, self-interested decisions, profiting from decisions that corrupt our policymaking. And we just can't have a system, which the current one is, so full of loopholes that it doesn't prohibit or penalize conflicts of interest, even though it's called the Conflict of Interest Act.
Now let's talk a little bit about the liberal questions and the answers and this sort of narrative. And you received some of these questions when you were at committee testifying on this very issue. The Liberals have argued, and Michael Sabia was arguing, that, listen, if we require people to divest all of their investments prior to taking office, we're not going to get the right people that we need in order to actually participate in the public service. We're not going to get the top people in Canada. And well, before I give my opinion, just reiterate what you said at committee, and for Canadians that may not have seen it, what's your take on that?
First of all, it's really elitist position to say that wealthy people are better. They're better people to be serving as politicians, people who are invested in coming out of big business circles. I mean, most policy questions are values questions in the end. You take the evidence, you look at the situation, people proposing solutions to problems, and it's your values. Where you sit on the spectrum of politics in terms of how interventionist you think the government should be, or laissez-faire, libertarian, that's just values, and that's not based at all on your experience in business. In fact, lots of business people, when they get into politics, end up in huge scandals because in business, nepotism is allowed. You can hire your kids. Wining and dining people and essentially bribing them to try and win a contract is legal. Patronage, promoting people who have no merit being promoted. All those things are legal in business. There's no Access to Information Act for business. So transparency, waste prevention. There's no rules that say you have to be using and getting value for money. So they come out of business with all these bad things that mean you can be unfair, dishonest, secretive, wasteful, and they don't make the greatest politicians. In fact, studies by Rotman School of Business at University of Toronto and American universities, they did some clinical studies, and it showed that wealthy people are more likely to violate laws than people with low incomes. So we're talking about not getting the most ethical people, and it's just totally elitist that they assume you're wealthy, you're good for the country, and it's just not been proven true by the past. It's also ridiculous to say that's more important than ensuring government integrity. Ensuring government integrity, according to the Supreme Court of Canada in a ruling called R.V. Hinchy in 1996 and a few other rulings since, if we don't protect the appearance of integrity, if we don't ensure our system not only has integrity, where everyone's required effectively to serve the public interest and not serve their own interests, but beyond that, if it doesn't appear to the public that that system is really working and has the appearance of integrity as well as actual integrity, then we're not a democracy. So to say that it's more important to have a system, a channel for big business people who are wealthy and other wealthy individuals to get into politics and not have to do anything to conserve themselves, that's more important than integrity is just getting it completely backwards if you actually want to have democratic good government and you don't want to have corruption and waste of the public's money.
So is there any legal precedent or guidance as to how we should actually handle conflict of interest in Canada?
Yeah. In terms of back in 1987, there was a public inquiry into a cabinet minister with financial conflicts of interest. And the judge, Justice Parker is his name, recommended banning blind trusts because they're sham, and also requiring the selling of investments because it's the only way to stop conflicts of interest. And the only exemption would be if you have a family business or family farm, your family wouldn't be forced to sell their business or farm. You would keep it, but you would have to publicly recuse yourself, step aside every time there was even an appearance of a conflict of interest in a decision you were making. And politicians across the country have ignored that recommendation since. It was also made in the 1984 inquiry report called the Star Sharp Report. And they just ignored it and instead set up this system that doesn't prevent, prohibit, or penalize conflicts of interest, and really should be called the Almost Impossible to be in a Conflict of Interest Act. We haven't talked about them all, but there are a dirty dozen loopholes in this law that allow for secretive profiting when making decisions and policy and spending decisions by cabinet ministers and top government officials. And they all need to be closed in order to have an effective system, or we're going to continue to see lots of scandals involving corruption and waste of the public's money.
Okay, so I know that there's a lot of Canadians that are frustrated out there seeing this happen, watching the announcements come out and seeing the conflicts of interest, watching this testimony. It's very frustrating for them. They may feel like they can't really do a lot, but what we've been seeing is there's actually been even recent cases as recent as this week where public pressure can force the government to actually do something, can force the government to make changes. And the other way to force the government to do that, everybody, is to support organizations like Democracy Watch. They really do a lot of work, no matter the government, doesn't matter if it's conservative or liberal. They treat all parties equally in terms of whether there's corruption or not, and try and hold them accountable. So, Duff, I just want to say on behalf of all Canadians, thank you for what you and your organization has done for the last 30 years and will continue to do so going forward. And if there's any other recommendations that you have for Canadians to take a more active role in order to help keep this government or any future government to account.
Thank you very much for your interest. And I would just suggest everybody contact your MP, because it looks like the ethics committee is, because the Conservatives and Bloc are very interested in seeing some changes. They're going to recommend some strong changes, but those changes will only be implemented if there's pressure on all the parties and MPs from all parties and the party leaders to actually put it into a bill and change this almost impossible to to be in a conflict of interest act into an actually effective act that prevents, prohibits, and penalizes conflicts of interest.